"You were never family, you just married into it," she said, and she laughed while I signed away my house. The pen was a cheap one. Blue plastic, county issue, the kind they keep in a cup by the metal detector. Joanne Yarbrough wrote her name on the line they pointed to, slow and even, the same hand that had closed the eyes of more strangers than most people meet in a lifetime. 47 years old, a nurse's signature, neat, dated in the margin out of habit. And across the table, Darlene Yarbrough laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a real one. The laugh of a woman who thinks she is just one. "There it is," Darlene said to the lawyer beside her. Took her long enough? Nobody at that table moved. Not the bank's attorney, not the clerk with the stamp, not Darlene's lawyer, a tidy man named Pruitt who suddenly found his folder very interesting. The room held still the way a room does when one person is being smaller than everyone expected, and everyone has decided to pretend they did not see it. Joanne set the pen down. She did not raise her voice. She had never once raised her voice in that family, not in 20 years. She just slid the folder back across the table, the thick one Darlene had handed her, and she said, "You'll want to keep your copy." By the time the two of them walked out of that Kingsport courthouse, the woman laughing at that table would understand exactly what she had put her name on. She would understand it down to the last page, the page nobody at that table had bothered to read, the one taped shut inside the very folder she had used as a weapon. But that comes later. Let me take you back. 6 months earlier, the light came into the kitchen on Watauga Street the way it always did, slow and gold, hitting the rim of the sink at 6 in the morning like it had an appointment. Joanne was already up. She was always already up. 22 years of waking before the sun does that to a person, and she had stopped fighting it sometime around her 40th birthday. She stood at the counter in her robe with a mug of coffee going cold beside the toaster, looking out the window at the fig tree in the back. Eli planted that tree. It had been a stick in a bucket when he carried it home from the hardware store on Stone Drive, and now it was taller than the porch roof, heavy with fruit nobody but her ever bothered to pick. This was the house. A brick craftsman with a wraparound porch on the edge of the Borden Mill neighborhood, on the kind of street where the neighbors knew whose porch light had burned all night because somebody inside was sick. Joanne knew that street. She had been the one walking other people's porches at 2 in the morning more times than she could count, bag in hand when the hospice calls came in. She and Eli had rebuilt that house room by room. That is not a figure of speech. When she married into the Yarbrough family at 25, the place was half rotted, a wedding gift that was really a burden, the old man's house that nobody else wanted. Eli was a widower then. Darlene came later, a second marriage, a woman who arrived after the hard work was done and acted as though she had always been there. Joanne and Eli did the work. She remembered the summer they tore out the kitchen down to the studs, the two of them eating sandwiches on the back steps because there was no counter to eat on. She remembered him teaching her to read a contractor's invoice line by line, his thick finger moving under each number. "Read every word, Joanne," he used to say. "A man who's robbing you is counting on you being polite about it. Don't be polite, be slow." She had taken that to heart in a way Eli probably never imagined. At work, they teased her about it. 20 years a palliative care nurse at the regional medical center, and she still dated every chart, initialed every page, kept a record of every conversation with every family in a way the younger nurses found exhausting. "Fussy," one of them called her once, not unkindly. Joanne just smiled. When you sit with people in the last hour of their lives, you learn that the truth lives in the details and that the people who lie to you are counting on you to be too tired to check. She wore Eli's habits the way other people wear a wedding ring, and she wore something of his, too, on the lanyard around her neck with her hospital badge. A small brass key, worn smooth, the kind that fits an old cabinet lock. She had carried it for 3 years and could not have told you that morning exactly what it opened. She only knew Eli pressed it into her hand near the end and said, "You hold on to this, you especially." She thought it was just a keepsake, an old man's sentiment. She would learn otherwise, but not yet. Eli had been gone 3 years now. He died in the spring, in the front bedroom with the good light, and Joanne nursed him through every day of it because that is what she did, and that is what he was to her. Her own people had turned her out young for reasons that were theirs and not worth retelling, and Eli Yarbrough had taken her in when she had nowhere, fed her at his table, walked her down the aisle when she married his son. He treated her like blood. He was the only one in that family who ever did. His son, her husband Wendell, had been gone longer than Eli, a heart thing, sudden, in his 50s. So it was just Joanne and the old man at the end, and then it was just Joanne. And the house, and Darlene, who lived across town in a brick colonial with white columns and a country club sticker on the back glass of her car, and who had decided, somewhere in those 3 years, that the house on Watauga Street should have been hers all along. Darlene had a way of saying things in front of company. That was her instrument. At Thanksgiving, with the cousins around the table and the casserole steaming, she would lay a hand on Joanne's arm and say to whoever was new, "And this is Joanne. She's the girl who married up," said with a smile. Always a smile, as if it were affection, as if everyone did not understand exactly what it meant, that Joanne had come from nothing, that she did not really belong to the name, that her presence at the head of that table was a kind of permission Darlene could revoke. For 20 years, Joanne had let it slide off her. She refilled the iced tea. She carried the dishes to the kitchen. She was the one who remembered which cousin couldn't have dairy and which uncle needed his pills at 8. The family ran on her, and the family called her the help, and she let them. Because Eli was there, and Eli knew, and his knowing was enough. Then Eli was gone, and the smiling stopped covering for the thing underneath. It started with phone calls. Darlene, asking questions about the estate, about what Eli left, about the family's situation. Joanne answered them plainly. The house was Eli's. Eli had left it to her. She had the deed, recorded down at the county, her name on it clean. She had checked it herself the week after the funeral, the way Eli taught her, slow, reading every word. Darlene did not like that answer. The calls got shorter. Then they came through Pruitt, the tidy lawyer, on letterhead. There was language Joanne had to read 3 times. Something about the original transfer of the property from Eli to her being improper. Something about Eli's capacity in his final year. Something about Darlene, as his surviving wife, having a claim the courts would need to clarify. Joanne sat at the kitchen table with that letter, the morning light moving across it, and she felt the old sickness rise up in her chest, the one she knew from 100 bedsides. The moment a family learns the will does not say what they hoped. She had watched grief turn to greed across a hospital bed more times than she could stand to remember. She just never thought she would be the one on the other side of it. She called a lawyer of her own, a woman named Carlisle downtown, who read the letter and frowned and said the words, "Elderly widow and Tennessee probate and judges don't love throwing a man's wife out into the street, even when the paper's clean." She said a trial would cost more than Joanne had. She said the smart, cheap, awful move was the one Darlene's side was quietly offering, a settlement, a signing. Sign the house into a new arrangement, a family trust with Darlene as the controlling trustee, and avoid the cost and the noise and the risk of a judge who felt sorry for a grieving widow in a courtroom. "It's not fair," Carlisle said, "but fair and cheap don't always live in the same house." Joanne did not answer right away. She did the thing she always did when a room expected her to break. She got quiet, she got slow. That night, she pulled out the deed folder, the one Darlene's lawyer kept demanding be brought complete and intact to the signing, the original, all of it, every page Eli had ever filed on the property. Pruitt's office had been very particular about that. Bring the whole original folder. They had even sent a man to confirm she had it. At the time, it struck her as odd, the bank caring so much about the paper she already owned. She set it aside as lawyer fussiness, the kind she usually respected. She did not open the folder that night. She would tell herself later she should have. She poured the cold coffee down the sink, turned off the kitchen light, and stood for a minute in the dark looking at the fig tree black against the street lamp. The signing was set for a Tuesday. Routine, Pruitt's office kept calling it. A formality, nothing to worry about. Just bring the folder and a pen and your patience. Joanne brought all three. What she did not yet know, standing in that dark kitchen with Eli's brass key warm against her chest, was that her father-in-law had sat at that same table years before he died, with that same folder open in front of him, and had done a thing only a man who truly knew his wife would think to do. He had read every word. Then he had added a few of his own, and he had taped them shut inside the very folder on the last page, the page nobody ever read. She would find it. But first she had to lose. First she had to walk into that courthouse and take that cheap blue pen and listen to Darlene Yarbrough laugh and sign her own house away in front of a room full of people who looked at their shoes, because the signing was the trap. And Joanne, who had spent her whole life reading the fine print other people skipped, was about to learn that the man who raised her had read it first. The Tuesday came the way bad Tuesdays do, dressed up as nothing. Joanne ironed her blouse the night before. She did not know why. You do not iron for a thing you are dreading. But her hands wanted something to do, so she stood at the board in the back room and pressed the collar twice, and hung it on the closet door where she could see it from the bed. She slept 4 hours. She was used to 4 hours. At 5:45, she was standing at the kitchen window on Watauga Street with her coffee, watching the light come up over the fig tree, and she let herself look at the room the way you look at a face you are about to lose. The cabinets she and Eli hung. The tile behind the sink, she set herself one summer, kneeling on a towel with the grout drying on her knuckles while he read her the directions off the box. The window itself, the one catching the gold now, they had widened together so the morning would come in. 20 years of mornings. She drank her coffee and she did not cry, because crying was a thing she had trained out of herself a long time ago, at a lot of bedsides, holding a lot of other people's hands. You do not get to fall apart. You are the one who stays standing so somebody else can fall. She took the folder off the table. The deed folder, thick, soft at the corners from handling, the one Pruitt's office had been so particular about. Bring it complete. Bring it intact. Bring all of it. She had it. She slid it into her bag next to a county-issue pen she didn't know she'd need, and the brass key swung against her badge as she bent, and she went out the front door and stood a second on the porch where the light burned all night for sick neighbors, and then she drove downtown to sign her life away. The courthouse in Kingsport is a stout brick building with wide steps and a metal detector inside the door and a cup of cheap pens by the conveyor belt. Joanne went through. She set her bag on the belt and her badge and the brass key with it, and the guard waved her through and handed her things back without looking. And she walked down a corridor that smelled like floor wax and old paper to a conference room with a long table. Darlene was already there. Of course she was. Darlene Yarbrough in a cream jacket with gold buttons, her hair set, a coffee from the good place across the street, sweating a ring onto the table. Pruitt beside her with his tidy folder. The bank's attorney, a younger man at the end. A clerk with a stamp. Carlyle, Joanne's own lawyer, came in a minute later, apologetic, parking deck flustered, and sat down next to Joanne and squeezed her arm once and whispered, "You're sure?" And it was not really a question, and Joanne did not really answer it. They went through it the way they go through these things. Pages turned. Pruitt narrated in his soft, level voice, the trust, the trustee, the transfer, the consideration, words built to sand the edges off the thing they were actually doing, which was taking a woman's home and handing the control of it to the one person on earth who had never wanted her in it. Joanne listened. She read every page they slid in front of her, slow, the way Eli taught her, her finger under the lines, and Pruitt waited each time with a patience that was almost respect, and Darlene did not wait well. "She reads like she's defusing a bomb," Darlene said to the room, light, smiling, and a couple of people gave the small laugh you give your boss. "Honey, It's the same words it was on page 4. Joanne kept reading. She finished the page. She turned it. And then they were at the line. Pruitt set his finger by the little penciled X and said, "Right here, Mrs. Yarbrough," and for 1 second nobody was sure which Mrs. Yarbrough he meant, because they were both Mrs. Yarbrough, that was the whole rotten joke of it. 2 women with the same dead men between them and the same name and nothing else shared at all. He meant Joanne. He always meant Joanne. She picked up the cheap blue pen. She wrote her name on the line, neat, even, the hand of a woman who had signed 1,000 charts at 3 in the morning. She dated it in the margin out of habit, the way she dated everything, and she would think about that small reflex later, how it was the most natural thing in the world to her, and how it would matter. And Darlene laughed, a real one. Out loud, head back, the laugh of a woman who has been waiting 20 years for a door to finally close. "There it is," she said to Pruitt. Took her long enough. And then she leaned in, close enough that only Joanne and maybe Carlisle could hear it under the laugh. And she said the thing she had been saving, the thing that was the true deed in her heart long before any paper. You were never family. You just married into it. The room held still the way rooms do when one person is being smaller than everyone expected and everyone has decided to pretend they didn't see. The bank's attorney looked at his folder. The clerk looked at her stamp. Carlisle started to say something and Joanne put 2 fingers lightly on her wrist, the way you quiet a patient's hand. Joanne set the pen down. She did not raise her voice. She slid the thick folder back across the table. The original, the one Darlene's side had demanded come whole and intact, and she said, "You'll want to keep your copy." She stood up. She picked up her bag. The brass key swung against her badge, and she walked out of that room and down the wax-smelling corridor, with her back straight. And behind her she could hear Darlene already on the phone to someone, bright, victorious, saying the word done, saying the word finally, saying a thing about the family name. That should have been the end of it. For most people it would have been, you sign, you grieve, you find an apartment, you carry your boxes out past the fig tree one last time, and you let the house become a thing that used to be yours. Joanne drove home that Tuesday fully intending to do exactly that, because she did not yet know what she was carrying. What turned it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She was a woman who filed. That night, she sat at the kitchen table under the one light and did what 20 years of charting had made into a reflex she could not break if she tried. She squared up her copies of what she'd signed to put them away. Carlisle had handed her a clean duplicate set in a fresh folder, but the original folder, the soft, thick one, was gone now on Darlene's side of the table, surrendered. Joanne caught herself reaching for it to file and finding only the new one, and she frowned, because she was the kind of person for whom an incomplete file is a small physical discomfort, like a stone in a shoe, and she remembered. The original had one thing the duplicate didn't, the back. Pruitt's office had photocopied the front matter for everyone, all the recorded pages, but the original folder itself had a stiffness at the very back. She'd registered 100 times over 3 years without ever thinking about. The way you stop seeing a thing you see every day. A last page that wasn't a page. Thicker. Taped. She'd given it away. She had handed the whole original across the table because they told her to. Intact, complete, and Darlene had taken it like a trophy, and neither of them had ever once looked at the back. Joanne sat very still in her kitchen. Then she did something she had not done in 3 years. She drove back downtown in the dark to the county clerk's office that kept late hours 1 night a week for recordings and filings, the kind of small civic mercy that exists in towns like Kingsport and almost nowhere else. She did not entirely know why she was going. She knew only that her father-in-law had been particular about that folder too, years ago, in his own way, and that 2 particular men aiming at the same folder from opposite directions was the kind of pattern her whole life had taught her to read. The clerk's office was nearly empty, one window open, and the man behind it looked up at her and went still. The way you do when a face arrives that you've been half expecting for years without admitting it. "You're Joanne," he said. Not a question. Eli's Joanne. His name was Reggie Holloway. He'd worked that counter longer than she'd been a Yarbrough, recorded half the deeds in that end of the county, and he had a slow, careful way about him that she recognized instantly because it was Eli's way, the way of a man who has watched paper outlast people and learned to respect it. "I knew him," Reggie said, "recorded for him going back years." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he said the thing that turned the whole night over. "Eli filed something with me. Told me. Must be 4 years back now," he said. "Reggie, one day a woman's going to come in here asking, and when she does, you give her what I left. He told me you'd come asking one day." He paused. "Took you a while." "Took me a while," Joanne agreed, low and even. He went into the back. He was gone long enough that she counted the clock. When he came out, he was carrying a thin recorded copy, stamped and dated in the old way, the county's mark pressed into the corner, and he set it on the counter between them under the buzzing light, and Joanne read it the way Eli taught her, slow, her finger under every line, and the floor of her stomach dropped clean out. It was a reversion clause, recorded, dated and witnessed years before Eli died, before he was ever sick, when no one could say his mind was anything but his own. Plain language, the kind Eli loved, the kind he'd taught her to demand. Any transfer of the property on Watauga Street made through deception, through fraud, through misrepresentation, through any signature obtained by trickery, voided itself the instant it was made, and the house passed not to the trust, not to Darlene, but to Joanne, in trust, protected, untouchable. He had known. Years ago, healthy and clear-eyed at his own kitchen table, Eli Yarbrough had looked down the road at exactly this Tuesday, at this room, at this woman in the cream jacket with the gold buttons, and he had built a door that only her own dishonesty could open. The fraud was the key. The lie was the trigger. Darlene had not won anything across that table. She had pulled a pin, and there was Eli's signature at the bottom, the thick hand, and beside it, Reggie's recording stamp. And Joanne stood in the empty office and pressed 2 fingers to her mouth and did not cry, but it was close. It was the closest she had come in 3 years. Then she saw the second page. Stapled behind the clause was another sheet she had never laid eyes on, and Eli's signature again. And this one was not about the house at all. This one had names on it, 2 of them, people she half knew, a young hospice aide from the medical center and a name from the old neighborhood. A woman 2 streets over, and beside each name, a line in Eli's hand. Careful, deliberate, instructions, provisions. A thing he had set in motion quietly for each of them and never once mentioned to a living soul. He hadn't only protected the house, he hadn't only protected her. Joanne stood at that counter with the brass key warm against her badge and understood all at once that the man who raised her had been planning something far larger than one Tuesday, and that she was only now reading the first page of it. "There's more," she said quietly to Reggie, to the empty room, to Eli. "What did you do, old man?" And Reggie, watching her face, said the thing that sent her home to a locked cabinet she had carried the key to for 3 years without ever once trying it. He said you'd know where the rest of it was, Reggie told her. He said you'd been wearing the way in the whole time. The drive home from the clerk's office took 11 minutes, and Joanne could not have told you a single thing she passed. She knew the route, the way you know a hallway in the dark, the turn off Center Street, the dip in the road by the old mill, the way the streetlight on the corner of Watauga always flickered twice before it caught. She drove it on hands that knew the wheel and a mind gone somewhere else entirely. Back to a kitchen table years gone, and a big, slow man in a flannel shirt with a folder open in front of him, teaching a frightened young woman how to read a thing properly. You read it twice, Joanne. He used to say it just like that. You read it once for what it says, and you read it again for what it's trying not to say, and you put your finger on every line, because the eye skips, but the finger doesn't. Most folks lose everything they lose in the lines they skipped. She had thought, at 27, that he was teaching her about insurance forms and hospital paperwork, because that was what was in front of them that night, a stack of intake papers from her first job. She understood now, at 47, alone in the dark with the heater ticking, that Eli Yarbrough had not been teaching her about paperwork at all. He had been teaching her about Darlene. He had been arming her, slow, patient, one kitchen table evening at a time, for a Tuesday he could see coming long before anyone else could. He had been wearing the way in the whole time, Reggie said. You'd know where the rest of it was. Joanne pulled into the driveway on Watauga Street and sat with the engine off. The porch light was burning, the way it always burned, because she'd never broken the habit even after there was no one left in that house but her to be sick. She looked at the front window and then she looked down, slow, at the thing that had hung against her hip every working day for 3 years, the brass key. She'd worn it on her lanyard so long it had stopped being an object. It rode against her badge through 12-hour shifts and code blues and the long, quiet sittings she did at the end of things, and she had never once thought about what it opened, because it had become a part of her, the way a wedding ring becomes a part of a hand. Eli had pressed it into her palm in his last good week, folded her fingers over it, and said, "You keep this one." He'd been on a lot of medicine. She'd thought it was the medicine talking. She thought it was an old man giving away small things at the end, the way they do, a watch here, a pocket knife there, trying to leave a little of themselves in everybody's hands. You keep this one. Joanne went inside. She did not turn on the lights. She walked through the dark front room she and Eli had stripped and repapered, past the kitchen where the tile she'd set still caught the street lamp, and she stopped in front of the tall cabinet in the back hall, the one Eli built himself out of oak before she ever knew him, the one with the little brass lock she had dusted around 1,000 times and never once tried, because it had always just been Eli's, and you don't go in a thing that's somebody's. Her hand shook, lifting the key off the lanyard. It had never shaken in a code. It shook now. The key turned like it had been oiled yesterday. Inside the cabinet, on a shelf at the height of a man's chest, sat a metal document box, and on top of the box, folded once, was a sheet of paper in Eli's hand with 3 words on the outside. For my Joanne. She sat down on the floor of the back hall in her ironed blouse with the box in her lap, and she opened it, and she read everything in it the way he taught her, finger under every line, twice, once for what it said, and once for what it was trying not to say. The original recorded clause was in there, the twin of what Reggie kept, stamped and dated and clean, the reversion, the protection, the door that only Darlene's own lie could open. But there was more, the way Reggie said. The second sheet, the one that had stopped her breath at the counter, with the 2 names on it. And now, in the quiet of her own back hall, she could read the whole of it instead of a glimpse. The first name she knew better than she'd realized. A young woman named Priya Okonkwo, a hospice aide Joanne had worked beside years back, sharp and gentle and dead broke, the kind of girl who skipped lunch to make a loan payment and never said so. Joanne remembered Priya leaving the field, remembered being told she'd gone back and finished her nursing degree after all, remembered being surprised because she knew the girl couldn't have afforded it. There was a line in Eli's hand. The Okonkwo girl. Schooling settled, quiet, no note attached. She is good at the bedside. The world needs her more than it needs my comfort. And a date, and a small notation that meant it was already done, already paid, years ago, with no one's name on the gift and no thank you ever collected. Joanne pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. He'd done that, quietly. The whole time she'd believed she was the only stray Eli Yarbrough ever took in. He'd been out there in the dark doing the same for a girl he barely knew, asking nothing, telling no one, because, he'd written, the world needs her more than it needs my comfort. The second name landed differently. Wanda Pruitt, the woman 2 streets over on Cedar, an old neighbor Joanne knew to wave at and not much more. And beside Wanda's name, in Eli's careful hand, a sentence that turned the whole night from grief into something with teeth. They tried this on Wanda first, years back. The same paper, the same soft talk, the same trust. I helped her hold on to her place. There is a complaint on file. If it ever comes for Joanne, the trail starts with Wanda. Joanne read that line 4 times. They tried this on Wanda first. It had never been about her at all. That was the thing that came up through the floor of her and stood her hair on end. The lawsuit, the routine paperwork, the cream jacket and the gold buttons and the laugh across the table. None of it was a thing that had been invented for Joanne. It was a thing that had been tried before, on a woman 2 streets over, years ago. The same maneuver run on a different frightened person who happened to own a house free and clear and happened to be alone. There was a complaint on file. There was a trail. Eli hadn't just built a door for his own house. He'd been watching the pattern for years, and he'd written it down, because writing it down was what he'd taught her, what he'd taught himself, the only weapon a careful man ever really has. Joanne sat on the floor of the back hall until the box went cold in her lap, and the streetlight clicked off and the first gray of morning started coming up gentle over the fig tree out back. She did not cry. She had trained that out of herself at a lot of bedsides. But she sat there a long time with her father-in-law's handwriting in her hands and let the warmth of the thing move through her slow, the impossible settled warmth of understanding all at once and 3 years too late to thank him that she had been seen, that the man who took her in when her own people wouldn't had spent the back half of his life quietly making sure that the one who stayed would never be put out in the cold by the one who wished she'd never come. You'd know where the rest of it was. He told Reggie that with the certainty of a man who knew exactly how well he'd raised her. When the sun was fully up, she made coffee, and she drank it standing at the window over the tile she'd set, looking at the fig tree the way she'd looked at it the morning of the signing, except that this morning she was not saying goodbye to anything. This morning she was reading the room a different way. The cabinets she and Eli hung. The window they widened so the morning would come in, not a thing she was about to lose, a thing that had been deeded back to her in advance by a man who'd loved her enough to see the future and leave a key in her hand for it. Then she did what she was. She filed. She called Carlisle first, the apologetic lawyer from the parking deck, and she did not raise her voice once on that call. She never did. But she laid it out so plain and so ordered that he stopped saying, "I'm sorry, Joanne," and started saying, "Say that again. Slower, let me write it down." The recorded clause. The date, years before Eli was ever sick, witnessed, clean, no question of a clouded mind. Reggie Holloway's matching copy at the county, the reversion language, the trigger, the fact, the cold, beautiful fact that any transfer of the Watauga Street property obtained through deception voided itself the instant it was made and passed the house to Joanne, in trust, protected, and that Darlene Yarbrough, laughing, certain, victorious, had spent 3 years in a courtroom maneuver and a cream jacket getting Joanne to sign a paper whose only possible legal effect, given how it was gotten, was to hand Joanne back the keys. The fraud was the trigger. Darlene hadn't taken the house. She'd armed it. "Joanne," Carlisle said, very quiet when she'd finished, "do you understand what you're holding?" "I understand it," Joanne said. "He taught me to read." She told him about Wanda Pruitt, 2 streets over on Cedar. She told him there was a prior complaint on file, the same scheme run on a different woman years before, that this was not one family's ugly Tuesday, but a pattern, a thing somebody had done more than once because it had worked at least once. She heard Carlisle go silent on the other end of the line in the particular way a lawyer goes silent when a family squabble turns, in his hands, into something with a paper trail and other victims and the kind of weight that doesn't stay inside a family. "That changes the shape of this," he said finally. "It was never the shape they told me," Joanne said. They filed to reopen. A motion to set aside the transfer on the grounds that it was procured by fraud and misrepresentation, with a recorded reversion clause attached, with Reggie's certified county copy attached, with a quiet request that the trust accounting be produced, because Joanne, who read every line, had a nurse's flat, sure feeling about what an honest ledger would and would not show. Carlyle attached the clause as an exhibit, the very clause Eli had buried in the back of the folder, the last page nobody ever read. The page Joanne had handed across the table inside the original folder when Darlene demanded it come whole and intact. The page Darlene had carried out of that courtroom like a trophy and never once turned over. A date got set. A reconvened hearing, a real one this time, with a judge and the bank's attorney and a clerk and Pruitt in his tidy suit and Darlene in her gold buttons, all of them summoned back into a room they thought was closed. The night before it, Joanne ironed her blouse again. Same blouse, same board in the same back room. But her hands were not looking for something to do this time. This time she pressed the collar once, slow, and hung it on the closet door where she could see it from the bed, and she slept, for the first time in a long time, more than 4 hours. Eli's box was back in the oak cabinet. The brass key was back on her lanyard, warm where it belonged, where it had been the whole time she'd been wearing the way in without knowing it. She lay in the dark in the house on Watauga Street and listened to it tick and settle the way old houses do. And she thought about the 2 names on Eli's second page, about Priya Okonkwo at some far-off bedside being good at it because a man she barely knew had quietly cleared her path, about Wanda Pruitt 2 streets over, who'd been the first one they tried this on and the only reason there was a trail at all. She thought about how a careful man leaves the world better armed than he found it. And she thought about the room she was going to walk into in the morning and the woman who would be sitting across from her in the cream jacket, still certain, still laughing on the inside, still absolutely sure she had won. Darlene did not yet know that the folder had a back to it. She would learn. They would all learn in order, layer by layer, in a quiet room with a judge in it, exactly what name had been signed and exactly what it triggered. Joanne turned off the light. The porch lamp burned on, the way it always did for whoever might be sick. And in the morning, she got up before the sun, the way she always had, to go and read aloud, line by line, the last page no one ever turned. The courtroom they reconvened in was smaller than the first one, a side room with bad light and a long table. And Joanne noticed, walking in, that someone had set the chairs too close together so that the bank's attorney and Pruitt and Darlene all had to sit nearer each other than any of them wanted. She took her place beside Carlyle and set a single folder down in front of her, squared it to the edge of the table, the way she squared a chart to the edge of a nightstand, and folded her hands on top of it. She did not look at Darlene. She had learned long ago that you do not have to look at a thing to know exactly where it is in the room. Darlene looked at her, though. Darlene wore the gold buttons again, and the cream jacket, and the same small, certain smile she'd worn the first time, the smile of a woman who has already counted the money and is only sitting through the formality of being handed it. When the judge came in and everyone settled, Darlene leaned toward Pruitt and murmured something behind her hand, and Pruitt did not murmur back, and Joanne, who had sat through 1,000 rooms where one person knew the truth and the others didn't yet, recognized the particular stillness of a man who has started, very quietly, to be afraid. The judge asked Carlyle to proceed. Carlyle stood, and he did the thing they had agreed on, which was to do almost nothing. He said that his client wished to read into the record a document that had been part of the original folder all along. He said his client would prefer to read it herself. The judge looked at Joanne over his glasses, and Joanne stood and opened her folder and took out the last page. This was attached to the deed, she said. Her voice was low and even, the voice she used in the last hour, the one that did not rise and did not shake. It was recorded by Eli Yarbrough 4 years before he passed. It was inside the folder my mother-in-law handed across the table the day I signed. It is the page no one turned over. She put her finger under the first line. The eye skips, he'd told her, but the finger doesn't. And she read it, line by line, the whole of it, slow enough that the clerk's pen could keep up, slow enough that no one in that small, bright room could pretend afterward they had missed a word. She read the legal description of the property on Watauga Street. She read the names. And then she read the part that mattered, the reversion, the language Eli had built like a man building a cabinet out of oak. Every joint square, that any transfer of the property obtained through fraud, deception, or misrepresentation was void at the instant of its making, and that upon any such transfer the property passed not to the taker, but to Joanne Yarbrough, in trust, protected, beyond reach. The room was very quiet when she finished. She did not look up to enjoy it. She set the page down and squared it to the others. "That's not valid," Darlene said. Her smile was still there, but it had gone tight at the corners. "He wasn't well when he—" "It's dated 4 years before his diagnosis," Carlyle said gently. "Witnessed. And it's not the only copy." That was Reggie's cue. And Reggie Holloway came in from the hall in his good gray suit with a certified envelope and the unhurried walk of a man who has spent 30 years carrying other people's most important papers across a county and has never once dropped one. He laid the recorded copy in front of the judge. The match. Stamp for stamp, date for date, the twin Eli had filed the same week, so that even if the page in the folder had ever gone missing, even if some careful hand had ever slipped it out of the back of the stack, the county itself would still hold the proof. "He told me you'd come asking one day," Reggie had said in the hallway weeks before, and now here it was, the thing Eli had filed against exactly this morning, surfacing on time, the way the man had meant it to. The bank's attorney was reading the recorded copy with the specific frown of a person realizing the file in front of him is not the file he was told it was. Pruitt had stopped writing entirely. "There's also the matter of the trust accounting," Carlyle said. And that was the third layer, and it was the one that did not need Joanne to read anything aloud, because the ledger spoke for itself once it was on the table. The trust Eli had left, the one that was supposed to have kept his widow comfortable for the rest of her life, drawn down to almost nothing. Withdrawals. A second mortgage taken against a house that was never hers to borrow against. Dues to a club, month after month, paid out of money that belonged to the dead. The whole shape of it laid bare in columns, the way a chart lays bare a thing the patient keeps insisting isn't happening. Joanne watched Darlene's face as the bank's attorney turned the ledger pages, and she watched the certainty go out of it the way color goes out of a face when the blood pressure drops, all at once, from the top down. Darlene had walked in, believing she was untouchable. She had walked in believing this was the formality where they handed her the money. She was only now reading the room the way Joanne had read it the moment she came through the door, and what the room said was that there was no money, and there was no house, and there was no version of this morning where she walked out the way she walked in. "That house is mine," Darlene said, and her voice was not low and it was not even. "That house is mine. I needed it. Do you understand?" She was standing now, though Joanne hadn't seen her stand. "I needed that house to cover what I owe. Do you have any idea what I owe? I am buried. I am buried alive, and she—" The finger came out, the gold buttons flashing, leveled across the table at Joanne. "She gets to keep it? A girl who was never one of us, who married in, who I had to introduce at my own table. She doesn't deserve it. I have a name to protect. I have a name." The room did not move. The clerk's pen had stopped. The judge was looking at Darlene, the way you look at a person who has just walked, on her own 2 feet and at full volume, through a door she cannot walk back out of. The bank's attorney had very quietly closed his portfolio. There it was, the family name. The phrase she'd hung on Joanne for 20 years like a price tag. The family name said at last in its true meaning, which had never been about blood or honor or the dead man who built the house. It had been about the dues and the second mortgage and the drained trust and the long arithmetic of a woman drowning in a life she could not afford and could not be seen to lose. She had needed the house because the house was the last thing left that could be turned into money. She had dressed that up as protecting the family, and she had believed her own dress-up right until the moment the ledger called it what it was. And then, cornered, certain to the last that she was owed, she had said the true thing out loud to the worst possible room, said to a judge, said to the bank's own attorney, said in front of the clerk whose pen was already moving again. It was no longer a family dispute. A family can be ugly behind its own door, and the law will leave it be. But a debt and a deception and a transfer obtained to cover that debt, confessed aloud to the people who hold the paper, is no longer ugliness. It is a record. Joanne had spent her life learning that the difference between a private wound and an official one is only ever whether somebody wrote it down. Somebody had just written this down. Carlyle did not gloat. He simply said, for the record, that given the testimony just offered, his client would be requesting that the matter be referred for review, and the judge, still looking at Darlene, said that he expected he would not have to be asked twice. Joanne sat back down. She squared her folder to the edge of the table. She did not feel the thing people expect you to feel in that moment, the hot, bright rush of winning. She felt instead the slow, settled warmth she'd been carrying since the night on the back hall floor, the warmth of a man's hand folded over hers in his last good week. You keep this one. The warmth of being seen and provided for by someone who'd looked clean down the length of the years and set a key in her palm for a morning he would not live to see. It did not end in that room, the way these things never end in one room. The prior complaint surfaced, the one Eli had written down in his careful hand, Wanda Pruitt 2 streets over on Cedar, the woman they'd tried it on first. Once the clerk's office and the bank both had a reason to look, they looked, and Wanda's old complaint stopped being a single-page gathering dust and became the first entry in a pattern. A review opened. Not a family squabble anymore, but a question with other names attached to it. Names of people who'd been talked across a table in soft voices and had signed because they trusted, and who had not had a careful man in their corner filing the twin copy at the county. That was the part that stayed with Joanne after. Not her own house saved, the others. She'd said it to Carlyle plainly on the phone, the week the review opened, and she said it without heat, the way she said everything. I had a father-in-law who thought ahead, she said. I had Eli. And what about the ones who don't? What about the next woman they talk across a table who doesn't have a folder with a key to it? Carlyle didn't have an answer. She hadn't expected him to. She'd already decided what the answer was going to be, and it wasn't a thing you said, it was a thing you filed. So she did what Eli had done. She went on her own to Reggie Holloway's counter at the county, and she recorded a clause of her own. She set up a small trust out of what the accounting returned to her, plain and quiet, no name on the gift, the way Eli kept no name on the gift. And she wrote into it that it was for them, the Wandas, the ones talked across tables, a little money set aside to put a lawyer beside a frightened person before the pen ever moved. Priya Okonkwo's name went on the paper as the one who'd helped find them, because Priya was good at the bedside, and Joanne knew now that being good at the bedside and being good at this were the same skill, which was simply not leaving people alone in the worst hour. Reggie stamped it and dated it and slid her copy back across the counter and said, Eli would have liked this, and Joanne said, I know. He taught me the form. The deed came back into her name on a Thursday. The paper was thin and ordinary, and she read every line of it twice, finger under each one, before she let herself believe it. The next morning she got up before the sun, the way she always had. The kitchen on Watauga Street filled slow with the gray and then the gold of the 6 o'clock light. The light coming in through the window, she and Eli had widened so the morning could get in, falling across the tile she'd set and the cabinets they'd hung and the fig tree standing out back in the new day. She made her coffee. She set the recorded copy of her own clause flat on the table where the light could reach it. And she took out her pen, the cheap, reliable pen she used for charts, and at the top of a fresh page she wrote the date. She protects them now.